Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of Art Tells a Story for 2021. This is our off-season schedule, but we're excited to be able to do a special episode in collaboration with the Columbus ReelAbilities Film Festival today. Art Tells a Story. Let It Tell Yours is brought to you by Nicolette Cinegraphics and Reese Brothers Production. Uh, Today, my name is Matt Swift. I'll be doing the hosting. And I'm a local educator and filmmaker and curator. And I'm so happy to be able to talk to two people today. I'll be having a discussion with both Susan Nussbaum, an award-winning author and playwright, and Salome Chasnoff, a Chicago-based filmmaker, installation artist, and educator. The two of them are here today to discuss their film Code of Freaks, which is now screening as part of the ReelAbilities Columbus Film Festival. You can register to see this film right after this interview when it first airs by going to reelabilities.org/Columbus. You can watch the film between January 13th and January 15th. So that's a Wednesday through a Friday between 7 p.m. and 7 p.m. So if you haven't registered yet for the film, there's still time available. You should go to do that at their website. Again, reelabilities.org/Columbus. So I'm honored to be talking with both of these people today because I'm somebody who has been working with the disability community for some time. And I'm also a filmmaker, and I'm also very interested in how genre is formed through the misrepresentation of various populations, such as orphans, and in this case, people with disabilities. And so, I'm very excited about this conversation, and I'm excited to talk to both these people. So, welcome, Susan and Salome. To start this off, why don't you? I'll start maybe with Susan. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and like how you got involved in this project? Like, how did this whole thing get started?
Well, I've always wanted to do this kind of movie because I've always been very angry about the way disabled characters are represented on screen. And so it was sort of something I've thought about in the abstract for a long time. And then suddenly Salome and I, who had worked together before, decided that we could do a movie about it.
Great. So, people haven't really seen the film at this point, and so, Salome, with your introduction here, could you tell us a little bit about, what brought you to this piece, and then give us a little bit about, what you'd want to tell people about this film and why they should see it.
Okay. Well.
Oh, is that a Susan question or a Salome
question?
Yeah,
go ahead. Go ahead, Salome.
Okay. Well, as Susan said, she and I had worked together on 3 short films that we did with girls with disabilities. It was a program that Susan was coordinator and I was director of another organization, kind of a media literacy and media activism organization. We worked with people who didn't generally have access to media production and self-representation. And we worked together guiding girls through the process and made 3 amazing shorts. And I would say that making these 3 films spanned like a 4 or 5 year period. And during that time, we built a really close working relationship and we enjoyed working together. So when Susan introduced me to this idea that she's been wanting to work on for a long time, which was to look at representations of disabled characters in Hollywood cinema, just really caught my interest. And we began by having salons in various community-based settings around the city where the people in the audience would be people with disabilities and non-disabled people, very kind of diverse in terms of the locations where we had these salons, and we strung together clips from Hollywood films that were organized around themes like blind men and women, or cure, kill, or magical little people. I think it was uh, intellectual disabilities, things like that. And we would have just show a montage, and then Susan and another of our team, Carrie Sandall, would facilitate a discussion. And audience was really, really interested in the conversations. They were really passionate about it. And it became obvious to us that we needed to, make a movie.
That's perfect. That leads me kind of to the next question, and maybe we'll move to Susan, and then we can come back to you, Salome, as well to answer this. Is what I'm really interested in is that the film, you talked about the themes and the clips you chosen. That is part of the film, right? These themes and clips, that salon aspect moves into the film, but then it also has many voices. There are many voices that are part of talking about all of these themes and these clips. I'm interested, like, how did you come about choosing the voices for this film?
Well, the main qualification was you had to be really into movies, and you had to know about a lot of movies, because we screen parts, little snippets of lots and lots of movies in our movie. And also you have to be disabled. Every one of our interviewees was disabled in one way or another. And people had really complicated and wonderful responses to everything we would ask them. And everyone was very different.
Yeah, I think I might want to add something to that also, is we didn't want to have like kind of a celebrity cavalcade. We wanted to have people that were in our community. And basically everybody involved is an artist or writer or scholar of some sort. So we wanted people that kind of a common sensibility went through the group, but also people that were just, that could speak for ordinary audience members. It wasn't about, featuring the celebrity, and it wasn't about the subjects. It wasn't about the interviewees. It was about the conversation.
That's great. Yeah. And so another part of that then is, right, so you have all these clips that you've put together. From a production standpoint, I'm just curious. There's a criticism that is happening within the film that is of Hollywood and its representation. We can get into more than that if you want, but with that, you're using a lot of clips from films. Did you have to go about trying to get rights or secure any kind of image releases to be able to use these films, or are you just going under that we're commenting on this, so we have the ability to do this?
Well, Salome is probably more equipped to talk about that, but yeah, there was a little loophole that we used in order to get the rights to all of these films.
I think I wouldn't call it a loophole. I would call it a legal practice called the fair use. If you're, if you're using something that is being used for critical purposes, then you have a legal right to it. But you need to have a lawyer who will write a letter so that you can get errors and omissions insurance, because if you don't have insurance, then you can't be publicly screened. So our lawyer went through the film with us meticulously over many weeks and months, like looking not just at the clips we were using, but how we were using them, the relationship between what the interviewee was saying and what the clip was representing, but also, the kind of the technical things we did to the clip to enhance or distort. And I think one of the big decisions that is legal decisions that's being made is this critique or is it entertainment? And so there were a couple of places where it could be construed as entertainment. We had to amend that.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about. Yeah, the fair use thing. I have a real long history with fair use and studied a lot of it. My master's degree is in library and information science, and so we spent a lot of time with fair use. And
fantastic.
Me and my wife actually saved several 16mm films that were part of a larger collection at the Ohio State University, and there's a whole thing around. We spent a lot of time with it, and so I was curious, like, because it seems very specific that the messages go directly with the clips in a very specific way, and I was curious if that had to do with the ability to use them in the first place, and it sounds like it does.
Yeah, well, fortunately, we worked with an attorney who was the co-writer of the fair use, so we kind of, like, he knew what he was doing.
Awesome. So I think what we'll do is, Susan, I'll go to the question for you first. That in an interview that you have out there, you say that right now there is no place in Hollywood for a disabled person. I'm interested if you can maybe provide me a little bit more detail on why you think Hollywood is not more inclusive of people with disabilities, especially as, like, all encompassing, part of the crew, part of the labor force, part of the casting, part of the writing. Like, do you have a thought on why you think that is?
Well, I think I heard the question. People in general are not, or at least the public and people who work in Hollywood and that whole industry aren't really very interested in the point of view of disabled people, and think, I believe, that they know a whole lot more about us than they do. And there have been movies being made about disabled characters or using the disabled character in a certain way that they think makes the movie funny or tragic or, whatever. And these kinds of things have worked very well because they're very manipulative techniques, and they're very duplicitous about what the lived experience of disabled folks is. And so that's one reason I think that they don't include disabled people in the making of movies with disabled characters. But there's been more pressure on them to open up a bit, and that helps. But usually the way they open up, when they're going to, is to try and find a disabled person, a real disabled actor, that they can figure a way to have play the role. And it's not enough, because there's a director involved, and there's a screenplay already written, and those are written or directed by non-disabled people. And so all the things that are wrong with the movie have to be looked at and examined from many different perspectives, and in order to really cure the sickness of these representations. And what kinds of the ways that disabled people experience these movies is very painful. For us, it's embarrassing. It leads people to believe that all the stuff that they know of disability is this, the certain way that Hollywood portrays it, that it sort of makes people believe that disabled people are very sad, that, all sorts of stereotypes. And of course, nobody likes to be stereotyped. And as we became a movement, a disability rights movement some years ago, we began to be very picky about these things. And of course, only lately have we started getting into, by lately, I mean past generation, getting into cultural questions.
I might only add to that, and this kind of, I'm saying this in response to the question that you asked me at the beginning, like why might people want to see the movie? Our research was pretty exhaustive. We looked at hundreds of films, and we actually show clips and discuss over 100 films, over a century worth of movies. So, we're not just, so that's one reason people might want to see the movie, because it's a nice little history of the representation of disability in Hollywood. And we focus on Hollywood cinema, so we don't really look at TV, which has shown a lot of improvements in the past couple of years, I think. We don't look too much at foreign films or like independent films.
We had to narrow it down someplace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It makes sense that you would have to narrow it down because, like I said, when I opened this up, I'd recently done a massive research project looking at the top 200, the top 20 box office films from 2001 to 2010, with the idea of creating a methodology around how are orphans represented in films. Because in a lot of mainstream films, either the primary or secondary character has some kind of familial loss associated with it. And then at the end of the film, in these mainstream films, there's a turnaround that happens. And what I found is that in that decade of, the top 20, 200 films, there's, 87 of the 200 films features, like, the primary character is orphaned in some way. And they don't even use the word. Like, they actually, they don't even say the word orphan. They find some other way to around it, right? And it's gotten better in the last handful of years. And, something that, I realize is that it creates a genre. It creates a trope that happens. But, I had to limit myself. I had to say the top 20 box office from each of these years for 10 years to try to get a data set. So basically you created a data set. We're going to look at mostly mainstream theatrical release films from Hollywood and go through a period of time. I did notice in the film, right, you start out, of course, with the title of the film with Freaks from the early 1930s film. Now, the interesting thing about that is that's a film that came out kind of pre-code. There's this era there where we had sound film, the silent film, the sound film, and there was this pre-code era where the mainstream film did a lot more. There was a lot more representation of things that just disappeared for like 40 years from cinema. And so that film was a time capsule of a period of film that it basically just was erased because suddenly we had these codes that were put in place where you couldn't show certain kinds of things. And I'm curious if you found out any information that the representation of people with disabilities was part of that in any way.
Well, can I respond by talking about the movie Freaks, which is where we got the title for our movie, which is Code of the Freaks. And people do ask what this movie could be about. And there's been a lot of conversation over the decades about that movie. So controversial. And why it was finally taken off the market and banned for some time was that it was seen as being obscene, really. There are a lot of disabled people in the movie, and they are really disabled, and they are part of a circus. They live their lives in this setting, and many of them have escaped from, situations where they had no autonomy, where they were separated from other disabled people. And these are things I didn't notice when I first saw the movie as a teenager. But when you think about it, this movie that was seen as obscene and banned for a long time because of it, and also chopped to bits. There are still scenes from the movie that were never found again after they were taken out. Nevertheless, the idea of disabled people, real people with real disabilities, being a community within the story of this movie, Code of the Freaks, it was new. And in fact, it's barely ever been anything even close to that kind of perspective on disability. The characters have very sort of normalized worlds inside this community, and they take care of each other. They make families together. They do everything. They work. They play a lot. It's just like any other movie or any other person, but the way that it's done is so out there, and it's so very different than what Hollywood movies have learned, how to sort of take back control of disability and that experience.
That's a great answer. Nice illustration of the film. I mean, it really does. The title of the film is part of my question in a way. So, Salome, did you have any response to that at all?
I think that, what drew us to the film was the representation of community, and we wanted to replicate that in our film as well. So the interviewees form a kind of community to have this conversation around film. I think that, okay, so there's, I guess it was maybe a couple decades ago, the Bechdel test, named for Alison Bechdel, the writer and graphic artist. And it was kind of a test that she brought to films to judge whether they were feminist or not. And one of the questions was, is there more than one woman in the film? Do they ever have a conversation where there are no men present? Do they ever talk about something other than men when they have this conversation? So there was, I'm not remembering. I should probably go.
No, that was.
No, that's totally correct. It comes out of a comic strip where basically one of the characters has this test.
Yeah.
And then it became part of this film theory it's really basic. I mean, it's not hard to meet this criteria. Mm-hmm. And it's so surprising how every year, you're able to go to the Oscar awards and be not a single film passed the Bechdel test, which is the lowest possible bar you could have.
I mean, it's funny too, because I think probably the movie going public is probably more women than men. But as well, definitely know the literature reading audiences. But besides all that, we began to think of films featuring disabled characters in the same light, because all the movies we were seeing, there was only one disabled character. So community wasn't possible. And the true subject of the movie was the non-disabled character, who the disabled character was really an instrument or a tool to bring this non-disabled character to some new knowledge or compassion or humanity. And meanwhile, the humanity of the disabled character was really not a concern at all. They were an instrument, a narrative instrument. So I don't know how do we get started on this, but so it was the sense of community, and what's the code? The tagline for our film comes from Freaks as well, which is offend one, you offend them all. Offend one, you offend them all, and that, in a way, is part of the code.
So I'm wondering if either of you have ever had a pushback on this topic about of being offended in a way, because I actually experienced this when doing the orphan research. Is that so within orphan film, within film studies, orphan film means something very specific, and it means films that are they have abandoned their copyright. It has nothing to do with people who are orphans. Um, and and I actually went to some of these conferences. I approached someone who was really involved in this community and said, look, don't you think that this is somehow unfair, that basically the whole film industry and has co-opted basically the term derelict film, but decided to do orphan film because you can raise more money to save films when you tie it to orphan? And he said, well, prove to me that anybody cares, that anyone's offended. Does this affect orphans at all? Where's the proof? Has anybody ever raised that question to you? Is really people with disabilities aren't happy with the films we're producing?
Constantly. Yeah.
But it's kind of oh, go on, Susan.
No, go ahead.
It kind of an interesting point too, because it points to what controls or influences the messaging in films. And over the decades that we looked at, there's a number of things that influence the messaging. Might be political, might be moral, or might be just economic. It's much easier to churn out the same formulaic message, just changing the set and the characters, because movies are so expensive. They really you can't really afford to have a flop. But also there are different times in history where there were more political or social influences. For example, after the war, when African American men that had fought were coming back, the film industry featured a lot of African American protagonists with a disability, because the disability softened or emasculated, let's say, the character and made him more acceptable for the community that he was coming back to. Because here were, men coming back home from the war wanting and needing jobs. And this was kind of a way to make that prospect more palatable for the audiences. So
Yeah.
Hollywood film has been used over the decades to influence public opinion around particular issues.
Yeah, and in the process, there have been, what's developed is this whole approach to film, telling stories, of using disabled characters as sort of a catalyst for not the non-disabled world. you know, for them to learn about, you know, an inspirational story about a really great vet who's Black, because I had never really seen sympathetic or inspirational Black characters in the movies before. And these kinds of inspirational movies are all over the map. I mean, you can see disabled characters who are men often being the superheroes, and especially blind men, for example, are play men that are really also the greatest fighters. You know, they go around killing people, even though they're blind. Get it? You know? So there's a lot of that. And then there's a lot of disabled women, blind women characters who are the complete opposite. And they're just fragile, blind women characters. They're very passive. They're very beautiful, played by very famous actresses, because everybody knows if you play a disabled character, you're going to win an Oscar, especially if you're male. And examples of these characters are like Al Pacino has done a movie with a blind character, playing a blind character who really hated being blind. Of course, all disabled people hate who they are and what they are. That is what we are portrayed as feeling in the films. And anyway, he won an Oscar for that. And they have beautiful women, very usually being chased by serial killers and things. And then they have Sal. I mean, there's so many different tropes, and they are all, when you think about it, like here's a disabled character who is newly disabled and really seriously disabled, and they beg the doctors or they beg their friends to euthanize them. And even though, of course, that's an outrageous thing to ask, and your life is still worth living, they always, in the end, figure a way to kill the disabled person. And somebody raises their hand and says, I'll do it. And that's, in odd as that is, the death of disabled characters in these movies, or the institutionalization of disabled characters, these are all inspirational endings. Like, in a way, I think disabled characters who die within the story are, and they're almost always killed by a non-disabled character, of course. They're seen as doing the strong, making the strong, tough decision. And that's what the inspiration is. The disabled character deciding their life isn't worth living. And that's hard to live with and go see as a disabled person because, well, it's annoying, first of all, when you see the same thing in so many films, you know, institutionalized, killed, murdered, basically, and in one way or another. And the characters are supposed to be us. That's hard.
So there is a very specific theory in ethnicity studies. It's called the rejection of identification. It's by, I can't remember his first name because it's hard to pronounce, but it's Diawara. And it's specifically talking about the really, you know, touchy film that is Birth of a Nation. And then he goes into Color Purple and some other things. He talks about how, you know, this very same thing that you're talking about, right? Is that you're presenting a character type that is like you, but there's something so wrong with the portrayal that you can't possibly identify with the person you are supposed to be identifying with, because you're just so turned off by the fact that they'll take a black male character and make him a murderer. And so when black males go to see these films, you're like, that's not who I am. Like,
no, because
you end up rooting for somebody else, right?
I think the idea is that the audience is always the general public, and the audience is not, the movie is not reaching out to embrace a disabled character. They're not. That's not what they're there to see the movie for. They want to see what happens and what's wrong with the character and you know, icky stuff like that. And that's what you're talking about. That same syndrome of who the audience really is. And the audience really is your basic mainstream kind of, you know, majority John Q public, whereas we as disabled people and people of color and, you know, immigrants and everyone that is marginalized in this country in some way or another are not who they're thinking about when they're making these blockbusters. So,
well, I think in some instances they think they're thinking about them, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have, you know, like, it's like you really needed somebody in the room with you. You made this decision. So, Salome, did you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I'm also thinking that I think it's the belief that people want a happy ending, and if not a happy ending, and if not happy, as you know, in the simplest, where you leaving smiling or laughing or whatever, they, you know, want a pretty clean. They don't want a complicated ending. So you can look at a lot of films that were maybe originally European films that were remade in the United States, where the ending is significantly different. The other thing you could look at for comparison is adaptations of movies from plays or novels, where, you know, the story is, first of all, the story's obviously streamlined. It needs to be somewhat streamlined to fit into a 2-hour little box. But also the focus, like it tends, particularly in narrative, it becomes uncomplicated. So the focus is on the individual characters and their, you know, their plots in relation to each other. It's usually often some kind of hero's journey, and you know, maybe the political intention of the play gets scrubbed out because it just makes the story a little too fuzzy.
There's a ton of
Matlin movie, what Children of the Lesser God. We talk about that a lot too, and how that was manipulated.
Or the sessions. We talk about the sessions.
I mean, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are examples of that across all of film history. I mean, one really famous one is I think Hitchcock's Vertigo. It originally had, the end of the film was when just like, you know, she falls off the roof, and they don't ever close up like the guy who pushes her off the roof and orchestrates this whole thing to trick this police officer, Jimmy Stewart. Like they don't ever close that up. But then they decided, because of the rating, because of the code, it's a rule that bad guys are not allowed to get away. That's part of the original like 1940s code, is that if you've done evil, you have to be caught by law. And so they had to tack on this really cheesy, like he walks into the room and they hear on the radio that he's been caught in Europe. Like, I mean, there's so many examples where they have to.
That's so interesting, though. It's very interesting because I think people think of code in a much more specific way, like certain words can't be used, certain images can't be shown, or the rating will be affected. But you're talking about where actually the story, it's not just like a decision of the studio, but it's like a forced decision.
Yeah, I mean, this happens all over the place, which is part of, one of that question about the code is that, a lot of the representations we have in mainstream Hollywood film, there's this, yes, you have the financial market, right? Other places around the world, they have actual, government funded film that's supposed to like help counteract that commercial film. In the US, like the films most people see, they're the commercial film market. It's a risk market. So you've got the economic component of it has to make money. So it has to be the lowest common denominator to please the most people. But then on that, you have this code on the side that's dictating what you can and cannot show. And that's just not specific imagery, but like attitudes about society, certain kind of character types. And that's that like little pocket of the early 1930s. They were showing women rising through corporate industries in certain ways. And they shut all that down. They were like, nope, we can't show women using the powers and the minds that they have to like become, to manipulate men and be in charge of things. They
didn't
like
reflect real life.
Right. It didn't reflect. It didn't reflect the life that they want to show. And there was actually a massive scheme that happened through several of the religious organizations in the U.S. to boycott film. So you had your pastor, your preacher on Sunday morning saying, don't go see this film, don't go see this film, to boycott films until they created this code. And a lot of the religious organizations were part of building that original code in the mid 1930s. So
yeah, and I agree, and I remember when I first read about that period. But I think too, for the purposes of this interview, I just want to make clear that the way we meant code was, as disabled people in the world, we have a way of talking to each other. We have certain vocabulary words that we can only use with each other, that we're offended when other people use them. We are connected in a wonderful way at times. Like when you see a person on the street who's like you, who's also disabled as you are. You wave, even though there's no reason to. And I think that's what we were trying to get at with our movie was what community means. And for disabled folks, like I think every community that finds itself rather downtrodden, to say, I don't know what a better word would be. It's important when you discover you're not alone. It's your experience is shared with many, 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 many others. And, we didn't learn that right away.
That's great. I was just going to say, and maybe there's also kind of a layer or nuance in the use of the word code. It's a code of resistance. There's kind of strength in community that allows people to resist the status quo and the normalizing messaging that denigrates people with disabilities.
Yeah, I mean that's an important thing with our film. Those Who String of Me. It's a film featuring two people with autism that they decide they want to get married and have a kid and ask his parents to do so, and but a big part of it is words. That's part of this film, and we learned something really interesting in the script that the screenwriter had built in all these definitions as part of it. And there's a moment where they cross their fingers, and the actress does the definition, like the explanation of what crossing your fingers meant. And I guess crossing your fingers at one time was code to acknowledge other people who were being oppressed by the society. And like that was just something really interesting that I had no idea about at the time. And it's a big part at the end of the film where she's like, well, what do we do now? We just wait. I guess we cross our fingers and wait. And they like cross their fingers at each other because now they're together. So, I mean, that element of being a community and is really, really, really important. And I think that would you, if you had your chance to make a film, I think this is a good final question to end up with. If you had your chance to tell a very specific story and make a film in this way, I mean, have you thought about what kind of mainstream film that the two of you might work together on that would answer some of these questions that you're posing?
Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a question in there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like,
I'm sorry.
So this is a documentary film, but it's a critique of narrative mainstream cinema.
Yeah. So what would we make if we could?
Yeah, I mean, how what kind of story would you tell? What would be the major components? Could you give a pitch of something?
First of all, I would put a bunch of disabled people in it. I mean, I'm tired of seeing, as Salome pointed out, movies with one disabled person standing alone or sitting alone and being sort of translated through the voices of a bunch of other people that are not disabled and don't live like that, don't understand that in any way. Okay. And I would also want the characters to be agents, be able to represent themselves within the context of the story instead of told about us by other characters. And I would also want there to be real sexuality in the movie. And I would build it around those things, first of all. But none of those qualities are really seen in movies with disabled characters.
I want to add two things to our movie, as long as I'm involved in the making thereof. I would want the film to show like the incredible, weird humor of disabled people. Very kind of special, funny, smart humor. I would want that to be in there. And the other thing I think it seems to go along with these other things that are going to be in the movie, but I would just want to make sure is that the movie shows disabled people in their full humanity. Because, I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes Crip Camp so successful, besides it being like wildly funny, etc., is that non-disabled audience members can relate to these characters, to these people in the movie. And I think that's kind of the failure of a lot of the films that, maybe all of them, the films that we looked at. You can't identify with these characters. They're not fully human. They're not somebody you want to be. They're not somebody you want to know. So, I mean, I think that's something I would really.
Well, and it's a question or a criticism that people aim at us often is we're critical of the films, right? We're really, really critical of pretty much all the movies that we ever see with a disabled character. And people are, they just don't understand how we can label all movies ever made with disability as a theme or a character as not good. And, you know, they don't pass our Bechdel test. And the thing is, okay, there are a lot of wonderful movies out there with disabled characters, but there's, even if they're wonderful, they have problems, really glaring problems in a certain part of them. So sometimes we don't explain the whole thing about why we dislike a movie, but there's always a reason.
I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's your data set. I mean, like we said, I mean, it's not all movies necessarily. I'm sure, yes, I agree with you that pretty much all movies still have an issue. I've been actually helping judge and curate off and on for the ReelAbilities Film Festival for a number of years now. I've seen a lot of films, and even the independent films made within that market, they fall into tropes. There's a genre. There's always the character who you like told. There's a film we were watching and we're like, man, this actor is amazing, and then he has a dream and he's walking.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
And I'm like, oh, you did it to me again. You did that to me again, like every single time.
Just
like
a classic. Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
Magical
like,
cure.
yeah, it's just, well, we had a dream. It was a dream of being able to walk, right? But
the
the
cure
actor,
the cure is a version of the kill,
right?
or an institutionalization.
They're both inspirational.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the disabled character either has to die or has to no longer be disabled in order to earn their place, you know, in the community, be acceptable.
I mean, I really want to congratulate both of you on this, because what you've really done here is you've created a filmic essay, which is, in my opinion, is the beginnings of really teasing out the genre that is disability film and the problems within it. What makes a film a disability film, and how it represents society in a very specific way, and what we think about it, and what makes it like with westerns, right?
How it impacts us.
White costumes versus black costumes make good and evil, right? And there are these tropes you fall into, and you've really teased out like the essay that is, look, here is mainstream disability films, and this is what they do, and this is why that's problematic, and the genre needs to change. The genre should shift in a different way. And I really congratulate both of you on that.
Thank you. I think, can I just add one thing to what you just said, is that, and I appreciate those kind words, I really, and your appreciation of the film, that means a lot. But I think also, just like in society, in film, people with disabilities are invisible. So even though I think people are a lot more savvy when it comes to analyzing and critiquing race as seen in a film, or even gender. But for some reason, people just expect the disabled person, the disabled character, to be a certain way, to be utilized or exploited a certain way to benefit the plot. And, you know, of course, why not? And I think that's one of the things that we wanted to explore and expose.
I feel like we could go. I have a whole nother topic now because of what you just said. I feel like we could go on forever. This has been such a great conversation. I thank you both for being willing to come on with me today. I want to give a small plug again. It's Code of the Freaks. It's with the Columbus ReelAbilities Film Festival here, and it's available from January 13th through January 15th, 7 p.m. to 7 p.m. You can register for a free link to see the film. You register, and then an email is sent to you with the codes that you can access the film during that time. You go to ReelAbilities.org/Columbus, and you can find out more information there. I still just want to thank, Sneaklight Cinegraphics and Reese Brothers Productions for putting this whole thing together. This is Art Tells a Story, Let It Tell Yours, special edition for 2021. I hope you all can see this film and you're able to enjoy it and really start to understand what representation means. This is I think what the last thing that Salome said is that, it's about voice, right? And what this film does is it provides a voice that isn't typically heard, and is
Very critical
sometimes
voice.
right, yeah, and it's sometimes ignored in a lot of cases. And so I hope you're able to see the film, and I thank you all for tuning in, and look for updates on the next episode coming soon, hopefully. So thank you all. See you later.
Thank you.
Mhm.